December break in 2018 was supposed to be a relaxing retreat, an escape from the bore of countless hours in lectures, followed by more time poured over assignments. Instead, my break was spent feeling anxious, stalked, and haunted by something I still don't understand. What follows is my account of that unforgettable break. My story begins with me sitting on a warm couch in the airport at 6:35 a.m, waiting for my flight. The flight which would rescue me from the boisterous city of Boston. My first semester of college had been a ravenous hurdle to overcome. The assimilation into different environments, strangers becoming friends, and the struggle of college courses. Soon I'd be in the air, on the way home. The call to begin boarding my flight came over the intercom at 7:15, as the hints of sunrise began to form outside of the large windows. With my overpriced Starbucks drink in hand, I walked over and was quickly seated on the plane. It turns out not many people need to fly to the Appalachians from Boston. The flight landed around 8 o'clock. A nice smooth landing, the opposite of the rough break that awaited me. As I exited the entrance of the airport, luggage rolling behind me, I was greeted by my mother, who had insisted on picking me up. "If this isn't my handsome boy, come, I need a hug from my favourite son," my mother said, giving a smile so inviting it could melt all worries. "I'm your only son, Mum," I chuckled. "I've missed you so much." Embracing her open arms, I got a long-needed hug from someone I loved. "Just relieved you made it home safely. I was starting to get tired of FaceTiming." We embarked towards the truck for our drive home. Home was a 45-acre piece of land that rested near the base of the Appalachians. I say it was home because I have since graduated. Also, after that break, it never really felt like home to me anymore. Instead, it felt like it belonged to something or someone else. The nearest neighbours are my grandparents, who also lived on the land, several hundred yards from the main house. Most of the land is densely wooded, with thick overgrowth, making it nearly impossible to traverse. The majority of these areas are in the back, against the mountain. The year 1840 was when my family had purchased the land, and since for generations we have lived. The rest of the day was spent unpacking, talking to family, and playing with the dogs, which were kept in a gated lot next to the barn. That night I enjoyed a wonderful home-cooked meal, something I had been craving during the weeks I spent away. After showering, I slid into bed, comforted by a large red and black checkered blanket I had spread over the bed. The alarm clock to my left displayed 11:45 p.m. in bright red. With no intention of going to sleep soon, I reached over and plucked a book from the shelf. I didn't make it 4 chapters in bed before the quiet was disturbed by the crunching of leaves outside my window. Living in a rural setting, you learn all sorts of strange noises and sounds animals can make. One such way is by how heavy or light they walk. The heavy crunch of leaves indicated it couldn't be a squirrel or a small critter as the culprit. It's not common for deer to come this close to the house. I assumed it must be a curious one. The sound persisted for a few more seconds before halting. My curiosity piqued. I walked over to the window and peered out. The only greeting was the void of darkness. I returned to bed and decided to sleep, not hearing any more from my visitor as I drifted into dreams. The following several days were spent working with my grandfather. The project, which had been planned for months, was the renovation of the barn. It stood lonesome in a wide open part of the land. Its only company, the dog lot besides it, and the sea of fall leaves with their former homes bare. Each day a different task, replacing boards, clearing out old unused stalls, applying a new coat of paint to the roof. However, there was one thing each day shared. Every night I continued hearing the same crunch of leaves outside of my window. Each occurrence around the same time, like clockwork. It wasn't until the 10th night since I had come home I caught a glimpse of what was causing the noise. I'd gone to visit my grandparents after dinner and didn't leave until much later, meaning I didn't bring a flashlight with me. My grandmother was prone to carrying on conversations long after they could have been finished. One could often find themselves repeating the same topic for over an hour. With that said, it was probably around midnight when I finally departed on the lengthy walk back home. As I said earlier, from my parents' house to my grandparents, it's a couple of 100 yards, much of which is through open land, except for the halfway point, where you must pass through a carved out trail from one of the more wooded areas. A trail that we kept clear from any fallen limbs or leaves. This is where I found myself during the first real encounter, surrounded by trees to my side, with fallen leaves covering their base. The hoot of owls searching for their next meal. My footsteps alone down the path, barely illuminated by the useless built-in flashlight from my phone. I was alone until my pace was joined by another, one which walked among the leaves beside me. Despite me being a college student and a legal adult, I felt like a terrified kid at that moment. I tried to keep my cool for as long as I could. I really did. You might be wondering why I'm scared of something walking through the leaves. There are plenty of animals in the woods. When I say it joined my pace, I mean it was mimicking my movements. When I moved, it moved. When I stopped, it stopped. Right beside me the entire time, probably a couple of feet away, shrouded in darkness. It didn't register to me in that moment, but it's clear to me now. I was being hunted. I stopped my pace as I almost walked right into a tree. Standing there for a moment, my mind was becoming increasingly clouded by anxiety. That's when the thing broke protocol. Despite me being still, it took a step, crunching the leaves beneath it. Somehow, I knew the step was angled towards me, instead of alongside me. Not wanting to find out, I ran, not daring to look back or stop. I ran for what felt like forever, and considering it was pitch black, I had no sense of direction, other than the straight line I ran in, unable to tell if it was pursuing me. I ended up tripping over a root sticking out of the ground, crashing hard and rolling around on the earth beneath me, dirt getting into my hair and a hole ripped into my jacket. I scurried up against the trunk of the tree whose root had tripped me up, breathing heavily and my head aching. It took me a moment to recognise where I was. The pale moon illuminated the tin roof of the barn, which had partly been repainted with dark red paint. Slowing my breathing, I was finally able to hear the other noises, other than my heavy breathing. On cue, it seemed the crunch of the leaves began, slowly and steadily, getting louder with each step as it got closer. The dogs from the lot, a couple of dozen yards away, howling and going wild, until it all stopped, and inches away, the breath of the culprit began blowing into my face, sending shivers through my body. I reached and turned the flashlight on my phone upwards. The light caught a moth as it flung open, too wide for a human's jaw to make. The teeth, though, were almost human, but uncanny, jagged with black specks stained on them, saliva dripping all over them. The creature, or human, or whatever it was, quickly backed away, screeching, piercing the cold night air with a blood-curdling noise I'd never heard before. The sound started low to the ground before rising high in the air, like a singer being raised on a platform. I took my opportunity and ran. Understanding where I was, I made it back to the house, crashing through the front door and collapsing onto the floor. I tried to explain to my parents what happened, but they thought I was just being silly, saying it was probably just some rabid coyote or wolf. But then, they didn't see or experience what I did. The next morning, I installed a light sensor outside of my window. I didn't hear the crunch of the leaves anymore. It's been 5 years now to this date. Correction, it was 5 years to the date of no sign of the lurker, as I dubbed it. Until tonight, as I sit here in front of my house in Washington, I can still hear the crunch of the leaves outside, but now I think I can hear it beginning to tap on the window. Maybe I should take a look outside. This incident took place 3 years ago on the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I was on a camping trip with a group of friends of mine. For story's sake, we'll call them Mark, Max, Katie, and yours truly. After hiking, we finally found a decent spot to set up our home for the day, and nothing seemed off about the area. We did notice a couple of tracks and animal trails, but decided they weren't a concern. They didn't look fresh. After we finished setting up, we decided to stay up late into the night. Now, the next part is quite crucial. Sitting to my right is Katie. Sitting in front of me is Mark, and Max is to the left. In between us is our table with our radio. Now, behind Mark and Max, there is a steep hill which leads deeper into the forest, and behind me and Katie is nothing but woods and trees, but it's not very dense, so you can easily see someone walking behind you. From my position, I can see the hill behind them, and from their perspective, they can see the forest behind me. The jeep that we used to get here is parked off the trails, but it was still a fair distance away. The time was about 1 AM, and we're just sitting around the campfire, listening to music. Usual camping stuff. We're not too worried about the noise, because we're in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, at some point, I started feeling like we're being watched, but I can't figure out why. So I take my flashlight and look towards the forest, but I couldn't see anything. A few of them asked if I saw anything. I saw nothing, and so the night continues. At some point, I look over to my right, just past Katie, and I could have sworn I saw something over there. Something small. I ignored it and decided it must have been a small animal. All of a sudden, I hear something sprinting at me, full speed, on the dry grass. I immediately look over to Katie, and I can see from her expression she hears it too. I stand up, my body full of adrenaline, as I shoot up and turn around to see. But there's nothing there. Not a single thing. At this point, both Mark and Max are asking me what's going on. I just heard footsteps running at me. Both Mark and Max could see the seriousness in my eyes. We immediately throw more wood on the fire to get the fire going strong. while we are yelling and screaming into the woods, because at this point we are thinking it might be a bear. We start hearing noises coming from the hill, and I get freaked out because there's no way whatever this was could make its way around us without being seen. We decided, screw this, and we started hauling ourselves out of there. Mark was putting the fire out while we started to leave. As we started leaving, I pointed my flashlight towards the noise, and I could see a pair of white eyes reflecting in the light. And the movement it made will always stick with me, because it ducked down and tried to hide from the flashlight. That's when I started panicking, and we all booked it. Once we got to the Jeep and started to drive away, I can hear out of my window footsteps charging towards us, and I can hear twigs snapping and grass crunching. I floored it after that. This was an animal trail, not a road, so I flew down the trail, left the forest, and got off the mountains. We left all of our gear behind. The whole time we were leaving the forest, it felt like we were being pursued, right until we got off the mountain. I've dealt with bears before. This was not a bear. This sounded like a person running, and the running sounded very pronounced on the grass and twigs. I've always done urban exploring. I've been to many haunted places, but nothing made me feel as scared as I did that night. We haven't been back to that mountain ever since. From what I saw and heard, there is no way that this could be an animal. Whatever it was, we were not welcome in its company. About a year ago, I moved out of my parents' house. My best friend and I started renting the bottom floor of a duplex from our old pastor, who gave us a really great deal. He keeps our rent low as long as we take care of the yard. A small price to pay for cheaper rent. I don't mind the yard work. I don't even mind the travel nurses that work upstairs. My problem is, there's someone lingering outside my bedroom window at night. Now, I don't live in the greatest neighbourhood. It's not some rundown part of the city, but it's definitely not the suburbs. We get sketchy people. Sometimes I get to play the fun game of, is it a firework or is it a gunshot? For that reason, I like to keep my curtains closed most of the time, especially at night. Usually I try and ignore any sound that comes from outside. I don't want to stick my nose out and get involved. It's just safer to ignore it. However, a few weeks ago, it started getting worse. It started off small. I heard someone walking down the alley. I remember it because they were really dragging their feet, and it was so loud against the gravel. But I didn't think anything of it, until the next night, when it happened again. But this time, my light was on. I could hear them walking down the alley, stop for a moment, and then start walking again. But the dragging footsteps were getting louder. They weren't in the alley anymore. They were on the side of my house. They had to walk past my roommate's window, which for some other reason she always leaves the blinds open. When I realised they were on my side of the house, I quickly turned off the light and sat completely still. I didn't dare make a sound. They stopped right outside my window, and it was quiet for a few minutes, but I knew they were still there. I didn't know what they were doing. They were just staring at my window. I was frozen with fear. I didn't even move when I heard tapping. It was very soft at first, like they used the end of their finger. I thought about texting 911, but what do you tell them? I live in an area with homeless people, and now one of them is tapping on my window? It sounds absurd. I just sat there, frozen in silence for a few minutes, until the tapping stopped, and the person started dragging their feet away. I swear it felt like I'd sat there for an hour before they finally moved. The following morning, I told my roommate, and she was just as freaked out as I was. I mean, you have to walk past her window to get to mine, and from the outside, you can see straight into her room. She said she would keep her blinds closed, just in case whoever was lurking was looking for an opportunity to break in. I made sure that my lights were off when the sun went down. I didn't want to draw any attention to my window, but eventually I heard the dragging footsteps. I sat completely still in silence, just hoping they would continue down the alleyway. But they didn't. They didn't even pause this time. They just continued past my roommate's window and stopped right outside of mine. The next thing I hear is tapping on the window, followed by a few seconds of silence, and then more tapping. This time I silently called the police. I told them my name and address, and I told them there was someone tapping on the window, harassing me. The dispatcher told me that someone would be there soon, but when the police eventually arrived, the person had moved on. This continued for another week before I eventually contacted my landlord and told him what was going on. He suggested I buy a camera for the side of the house. He was quite understanding and also suggested getting one for the front door. We set up a camera. We got an off-brand camera because it was cheaper, but it worked just as well. A couple of days later, the tapping turned into knocking. The knocking turned into whispering, and the whispering turned into talking. But it was always random. Each time I called the police, and each time he would disappear before the cops arrived. I would always show the cops the footage, so they knew I wasn't making this up. Now, fast forward to today, weeks after this all started. An officer contacted me. He agreed to stay and wait to see if this person would come back. And can you guess what happened? He came back. His feet dragging along the gravel of the alley and the concrete path that leads to my side of the house. The next thing I heard was the officer telling the man to stop. He told the man to drop his weapon, the nail that he had in his hand, and told the man to back away. And then I heard muffled screams. I looked at the camera and I almost screamed because the man's face was directly in front of the camera. As if he was watching me, he continued to stare into the camera. The police officer asked him to back away, but he didn't respond. He eventually backed away from the camera, but due to his erratic behaviour, the officer had to tase him. A few minutes later, more cops arrived. They took me to the station to ask more questions and to take a statement. They also asked for the camera footage and went over some of the previous conversations. They finally told me to go home and get some rest. Later that same day, I got a phone call from the police. They explained that the man had escaped from a psychiatric ward and he had been on the run for the past 2 weeks. I know most people would have brushed this off as nothing. Someone tapping on a window, a minor inconvenience. Some people may have seen it as a joke. I really don't think, if I hadn't have had the camera footage, the police wouldn't have taken me seriously. I can't imagine what this man wanted, but I'm glad he's not in the neighbourhood. Hopefully he's in a better place. At least nothing was going to happen. The encounter made me feel quite uneasy, particularly at night. I always make sure my windows are locked and my curtains are shut. I grew up with my sister, living in a large house. I lived with my mother and my father. It was a big house, but it was so much fun to run around with me and my sister. We did lots of things together. We watched TV, sit around colouring books, and build stuff with blocks. Sometimes we read stories together. She would always be the last person to leave my room at night, and be the first there when I woke up. We were inseparable. I just couldn't imagine life without her. Even when I went to school, she was the first person I ran to talk about my day. She would always listen to me. She kept me out of trouble, but sometimes she played jokes on my parents. One day I woke up and I was stunned to find she wasn't there. Like how she would always do, she would always greet me. But that morning was different, because when I went to my parents to ask where Katie was, they couldn't tell me. I looked all over the house, but she was nowhere in sight. I started to feel quite uncomfortable. I couldn't find her. I started acting out in crying fits, fits of anger and frustration, calling out for Katie, but she never came. When I woke up each day, she wasn't there. And of course, I acted out again. This went on for a long time, until my parents would take me to a child psychologist. I kept on asking about Katie, but no one could give me any straight answers. I thought back to all the times me and her shared, the books that we read, the drawings that we did together, and all the times that we laughed and giggled. All of those times I asked my parents about Katie. They thought I was just making it up. They thought Katie was just part of my imagination. They had started to suspect I was developing some sort of mental disorder. For years I'd been seeing a psychiatrist. I told him all about Katie, how she looked, how she talked. I even drew pictures of her. But somehow I grew to accept that she was just not there. As I grew older, I eventually forgot about Katie, and I stopped talking about her altogether. But one afternoon, I was sorting through old junk in my parents' house when I came across an old drawing of me and Katie that I'd made. We were holding hands and reading books, and looking at it just made all of those memories flood back. I remembered Katie, and I felt a sense of comfort as I sat down looking at the drawing, thinking of all the times we spent together. But that's when I started to realise something. I took out my phone and started to look at some old town records, along with the address of the house I grew up in. It turns out that 10 years ago, before we moved into this house, there was another house that burnt down. A mother and her 2 kids made it out safely, but there was one child that didn't. 9-year-old Katie that died in the fire, trapped in her bedroom. I remember wondering why Katie's face was always pale, why it was red on one side, but I never questioned it. I wasn't schizophrenic, I wasn't crazy, and I didn't make Katie up. Katie was the ghost of who I thought my sister was that whole time. There are days I go home to visit my mother since my dad passed. I'll be alone walking down those long hallways, and I'll feel as though a little hand is holding me. I'd stop to close my eyes and whisper, "Hello, sister," and we'd walk into the room just like that. I like to think she's watching over my mother when I'm not around. It brings me comfort to know that Katie is still there,